First off, if in order to talk about any change in a person's treatment or any change in a person's revelations or problem-solving mechanics, we have to talk about the stages in which they get there, right? Last week, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we talked about the general adaptation system, which is a physiological system in which we go through stressful experiences and then we come to a point where our body, our mental capacity, our physical capacity are just absolutely exhausted. And so we have to come back down and we have to just kind of recollect ourselves. But sometimes when we have an excessive amount of cortisol or adrenaline just getting pumped out and our brain has no infection to fight, it's really just the mind playing games against ourselves. When that happens, and we have to try to find a way to just take a deep breath or trying to tap into this calm body state, at a certain point, we have to let go of certain things, or we have to sit with it for a second. Now, sometimes when we talk about anxiety disorders, we talk about your brain constantly moving in ways in which can be harmful, and again, eustress, which are things that are, a little bit more appropriate towards what your alarm system in your brain's supposed to do, right? So when we talk about breakdowns, we're talking about that acute stress, that acute anxiety experience in which you go through a lot of mental strains, like whether it's a combination of stress and depression, whether it's, going through the grieving process, whether it's, PTSD, whatever it is, you have to go through this process in which your mind and body are going through reliving these experiences in a high excited state, which means that your brain is constantly active, right? So what I put up here is a little bit of a diagram kind of showing the different parts. This is more physiological, but there's a lot of psychological distress going on with going through a breakdown in which, a couple like overthinking, you're obviously feeling overwhelmed, you can't sleep, eating habits are a little bit distorted, aches, pains, somatic symptoms. There's a lot of different components to how our physiological bodily response is triggered by mental stress. And again, that pineal gland, right? Exactly where hormones and things come from, in which our body uses it to alarm our different parts of our parasympathetic nervous system, right? So when it comes to feeling stressed and you can't sleep, right? Feeling stressed and eating or not eating, you kind of want to isolate yourself because you feel like other people would be burdens to you, and you just don't want that excessive amount of baggage on top of what you have already, right? So when we talk about a breakdown, we're really talking about this moment, this experience in which everything is just kind of coming together, and it's just overwhelming. When I mean everything coming together, not in a breakthrough capacity, but everything kind of coming through and becoming more burdens, more thoughts, more ideas that are just trapping you from this problem-solving mechanism that your brain is going through. It is stalling. It is just stalling your prefrontal cortex. It's absolutely blinding. And it sucks because when you go through those experiences of again, let's say you've lost somebody, and that somebody was very close to you, and you saw them 2 weeks ago, and you're starting to go through the 5 stages of death by Kubler-Ross, right? You're feeling angry, you're feeling depressed, you're feeling alone, and you're feeling like nothing makes sense. Well, that's because you're trying to come up with ways, you're trying to problem solve and trying to figure out ways in which is why things are the way they are. And even when you do come up with some reasons why, you come to this excessive amount that, you know, is what is going on? Is there something wrong with me? Is there something wrong with where I am in my life? Is there something wrong with whom I'm with? What I'm doing, right? Everything just coming together, becoming one big snowball of anxiety and stress and depression, right? So when you have a breakdown, and I have a client coming in talking about, you know, a single mom trying to get her kids to go through school, to feed them, to make sure they have a house, they make sure everything is right for their human development, right? And, you know, as parents, you want better for your kids than you got. You want the world for them. But when you can't provide and you feel helpless, even though you're doing everything you can, and just feels like everything's stacked against you, you go through this process of which you feel helpless. Maybe a little bit worthlessness, but more you feel helpless. That's more of what I want to highlight on. You feel like nothing can help this situation because you've done everything. And that's what those moments are about. That's what it means to go through a breakdown. A breakdown is that you're totally collapsing to the pressure that you feel around you. And it's kind of like, think about it this way. And I want to think, and this, even the whole discussion of what we're talking about today. Think about going underwater, right? And holding your breath and going underwater. And holding your breath as long as possible. Imagine that breaking point in which you need air. And you're still underwater. Maybe you've swam even further down. And then that breaking point is at the bottom and you have to swim and crawl your way up. That's the breakdown. You're sinking to the bottom. You have this moment in which you need air and you're climbing as quick as possible. Maybe you find a way up. Maybe you're swimming slower than usual and you're coming to a point where you are just barely getting any distance to the surface. Imagine what it feels like to take that first deep breath when you make it to the surface and you're up and you're above waters. Imagine that feeling, man. That's a feeling of accomplishment, sure, an achievement, but it's a feeling of relief that you've overcome something that felt like, say, you were crawling for a good half minute, bro. And that's a long time. If you're gonna hold your breath longer than like 2-3 minutes, you're better than me, man. But when you make it, or when you're about to make it, there's nothing in your mind that's saying we can't do it. Why? Because you know the objective. You know what you need to do. In order to breathe, you got to get above surface. You gotta get over this loop, this fucking hurdle of an obstacle, just to get to the point where you can breathe. That's the same thing. That's the same concept towards a breakdown and a breakthrough. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about that. Today I only brought up one study which talks about measuring brain activity through EEGs, and how, you know, small little things equate to this Eureka effect, right? So we'll talk about it, and it has to do with brainwaves, so you guys will be happy. We're linking last week to this week. Hey. So yeah, sugar cravings, if you have them, trust me, it's a bitch. You're just digging yourself another hole there. But you know what? I have look at this shit. Look at this shit. See, sour gummies, man. When I'm stressed, I eat. And when you have sugar cravings, it's even worse. So keep that in check, ladies and gentlemen. Digestive issues can go along with your eating habits and so forth. Or if you are just not eating and you're just constantly stressed, your body's being overworked. So there's no new energy to be consumed and to be reused. So consider what you eat there. But we'll talk a little bit more about breakthroughs and how to get to that point. What it is just in general. So again, these are all some of the physiological symptoms you could have when you're going through a breakdown. Again, a breakdown is kind of like a panic attack. It can be a panic attack where you have the physiological reactions of a heart attack, but really it's just an overexhaustion of mental fatigue, and it is wearing down your body. So if you do have a panic attack, just make sure you have stressors ready to go and willing to help. Something that is common that you use that is reliable, right? That you can reuse over and over again and won't be too bad. Again, it could be an object, it could be an activity. And again, we're also going to be talking about the incubation stage, which researchers use a lot in order to do a lot of their work. Incubation stage is where you are sitting, you're doing another activity, and you come to a point where you think about something else, right? At that moment, you might be reading a book, writing. You could be playing video games, you could be doing whatever. And then you have an idea towards something in your life you want to improve. And you just came up with the solution right there. Without even thinking about it. This is what we talk about as a process within working memory, within your preconscious brain, which is more of a psychoanalytic perspective. And it's just a mental process in which you've come to this point where you've solved the problem and you have this physiological feeling of relief and comfort. Going from uncomfortability to comfort. That's a huge... listen, like, when we talk about, like, people playing sports on a team, like wrestlers, they have to lose weight, they have to work out 3 times a day, they have to wear sweats, they can't eat, they can't sleep as well. Like, you have to force yourself to do things. You're gonna be in uncomfortable positions, but then when you weigh in, you get your hand raised, that it's like that physiological Eureka moment where you can just take a deep breath and relax, right? So, again, just a couple analogies, but in counseling, it's a little bit different because it's more of a process, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what are some signs and symptoms of a breakdown. So, 21 signs. As you can see, this man is going through some shit. He looks overworked. He looks like he's trying to figure shit out. And that's probably because he's feeling certain things like tremblings and shakings. He's feeling aches and pains. He feel sick to his stomach. He's, lack of motivation. Interest in sex is gone. Again, he's having acute anxiety where... And sometimes it's not even just anxiety. It could be depression where you feel like you want to isolate yourself away from people and you just want to kind of hide yourself and keep those burdens within and buried within, because you feel like you're feeling that feeling of helplessness where others can't really help you, and this is more something you have to go through, which is not always the case. You know, I want you guys to remember that. It's not always the case when you have these feelings within you and that somebody can't help you. That's not true. It's just the fact of what learning methods work for you and how somebody can use that to help guide you along. Right? Counselors are not here to provide you the answers, rather to guide you in the right direction. Okay? So, again, these might be the symptoms you might feel during a breakdown, and it might feel like this is it's permanent, but it's not necessarily true. When you have a breakdown or anxiety, panic attack or anxiety or acute stress, there's an ending to it, but the cycle can always come back. That's what we always consider as counselors, is that, okay, you might have this acute anxiety, you might have this point, you might be at this point where things are kind of piling on at this moment, but it doesn't mean that something can't be solved individualistically. Each problem that you have can't be solved one by one step at a time, right? So, but it just feels so overwhelming because they're all coming in at once, because, you know, it could be a feeling of identity, of, you know, that could unleash a whole series of issues. Say, like, you're having career dilemmas, and you might be, like, 35 years old, and you might be in a crisis because you're trying to figure out where you belong in this world, how you want to contribute your time, your life to, whether it's a job, some type of objective, right? Whether it's to make money or it's for acknowledgement throughout the world, whatever it is, you're going through this identity crisis, right? And then all these problems start to pile on to you. You start to feel like you're, you know, what you've done in the past hasn't worked now. What you're doing now is kind of lacking in interest and motivation. You've been brought up a certain way in which, like, say, like, you know, parents, they want the best from you. They want you to be a doctor, a lawyer, or whatever. Somebody superior that will help the world in a large capacity. But that's not your calling. And you've been told otherwise. What do? Well, you might go through these symptoms, and you might go through your panic attacks, and you might, you know, aside from genetic coding, you know, you might go through these experiences. Some people, and there is data to support this, that some people are more susceptible to depression and anxiety. However, it doesn't mean that those people are the only ones out there that are going through these processes, right? Anybody can. So when you're going through this identity crisis, say at 35, right? Or say you're in high school and you don't know what your major, or you're in undergrad and you're starting out undergrad and you don't know what your major is, and you're just kind of taking classes and spending all this money, and your parents have a limited amount of money for you to support until you have to go on, until you have to pick up the scraps and you have to pay for your college tuition. Things might just start piling on then. So, going through a breakdown is not always a bad thing. When you go through a breakdown, you're releasing a lot of... You're releasing these emotions that are piling on into you, that are in this glass bottle, and this glass bottle cannot contain the amount. So you break down, you open up, and you just need to sit for a second. Sit with these ideas now that they're all out in the air, right? Whether it's through hysterically crying and talking, or if it's just feeling like a vegetable and just having limited amount to say. Whatever you say, is a part of that process to getting to that breakthrough, right? And again, not every breakdown is going to lead to a breakthrough, but every breakdown has something you can take out of it, right? There's always some part of that moment in which you can take for yourself and use that for the next one, in which you say, okay, well, I've been through this. Okay, what has helped me? What has gone wrong? And how do we move forward? Sometimes problem solving is impeded by emotions because you're just so in that moment that it can be hard for you to change gears. But there are some things that you can take away from every moment that will contribute to the next moment and the next moment. In counseling, you're in a safe place. You're with somebody you can talk to, that you can be your worst state and feel like this person can help guide you in the right direction, right? You're rock. But they're there. They're just there as a resource. Counselors are just there. Professionals are just there. To come to this breakthrough moment, it has to be some internal problem-solving mechanism that goes on in your brain and processing each moment of the breakdowns, in which you found that this, whatever information you've learned, this knowledge that you've accumulated, will help self-improve in some capacity. And usually when we think about breakthrough, we think about, kind of accepting what's around us, accepting reality, accepting our reality to the reality around us, right? Just kind of finding being in unison with and being grounded, right? That's what it means to really come to that point where you're ready for a breakthrough, is that you equal yourself out. You don't think you're bigger than everybody else. You're really vulnerable to what happens. You're staying humble. You're accountable. You're all these things that relate to you finding some sort of progress in the makeshift of all this trouble, right? So, a breakthrough. And here are a couple things. You're questioning everything. You're realizing there's a difference between happy thoughts and happy feeling, right? So thoughts and emotions, separating the two. Separating your, all the issues you're going through, whether it's, jobs or personal priorities, whatever it is, separating everything. And then starting to problem solve. I was just looking at that as we were going. So here we go. Lo and behold, Russell Brand came and wants to talk a little bit about the differences between a breakdown and a breakthrough. So let's see what he has to say. Again, it's Russell Brand, so a lot of stuff just gets jumbled up in there, but I think he has a point. He talks a little bit about a couple stories in which that talk about this general concept of getting to a breakthrough, but there's certain processes you have to go through in order to find your breakthrough, right? So let's see what the big man has to say. Sorry, I like that song. Don't judge me. All right, here we go.
Have you had a mental breakdown before? I've had a couple, I think. I think I had probably a few in adolescence, where I just fell apart and thought I'm going to kill myself, but in fact became a drug addict. In my 20s, several times, self-harm, self-immolation, self-destruction. Not literal immolation, didn't actually set myself on fire, but still it burned. And more recently, maybe 5-6 years ago, I felt the narrowing of my life to a very fine point, a hard triangle of a life over, and me sprawled at its peak, hopeless and lost. and I felt I could not live the life I was living anymore, and that turned out to be true. It's commonly understood by spiritual people that a mental breakdown can be a mental breakthrough. It's something I talk to.
He talked about, I just want to pause it real quick. He talked about going through these different dilemmas in which, you know, the life he was living at the time was making him feel so uncomfortable that he realized his body, his mind came to a realization that he needed to change it, or else he would keep feeling the same way. So it's like, what is making this cycle reappear constantly? How do I find it? Even though I had these problematic behaviors, you know, kind of like the medical diagram in which you're kind of diagnosing and figuring things out. Where is the origins in which things are coming from? Not what are treating the symptoms, but treating what the disease is, the actual origin of how we're feeling, why we're feeling certain ways, and why did things keep reoccurring the same way. Right.
Brené Brown about, because it's part of you dying. Wim Hof, in fact, at the point when he lost his wife, when he had 4 young children, was able to break off the branch of who he was then for new shoots to form. Even in the worst moments of crisis in your life, new possibilities come about, and particularly when it's the mind that's cracking open. I feel the mental fragility still, but it's broken away so many times. The person that I thought I was has peeled away. I've shed so many skins now that what remains feels very true and real to me, and I hope I don't have to have too many more mental breakdowns because they're painful to go through. But I feel like rebirth is a necessity for growth. It exists mythically, doesn't it? Like Dante writes about, there's a point at the midway for me as a person entering middle age. There's a point where you look back at your life and think there's as much behind me as there is in front of me. If I'm lucky, I can no longer be propelled forward on the adolescent dreams and images, and neither would I want to be, as that fuel burns away. What gases, what fumes does it leave behind?
He talked about how he could physically feel the pain in his brain. Right? He could feel the cracking and feeling like, you know, kind of like a desert. Like the surface of the ground is just cracking because it's so dried up. There's no fluidity going on. And it's just, things are just clustering up, boiling up, and cracking because of all the, it's like your brain is in overdrive. And when things are being used too much, if technology is being used too much, it overheats, right? And that's that cracking sensation. Your prefrontal cortex, your problem solving parts of your brain that lead to your executive functioning, it's being overheated, and you can't really do anything about it except for like cool down. And even to get to that cool down period, you feel like this is happening for a reason. That anxiety, that cortisol, it's saying we need to solve this problem right now. Well, sometimes in order to solve a problem, you have to cool down first, take a break, and then hack back at it again. But some people think, oh, we're here now, let's just get it over with. It doesn't work that way, especially with psychology. Things are a process. It doesn't take, you're not going to take a pill and it's going to solve all your problems unless you have like a minor infection, right? We're talking about your brain. Everybody's brains are wired differently. You got to treat it like your second heart, right?
They say the Grail comes twice. The Grail is the emblem of truth. The Grail is the mythic window through which true beauty.
He's talking about spirituality.
Comes in adolescence, the offer
within
the grail,
breakthroughs,
the opportunity to receive the revelation. But me, I weren't ready as a teenager. I was insane in the membrane, bats in the belfry, a little bit kooky and crazy. Truth was the last thing I wanted. I blanketed down that truth hard under a brown rug of hard drugs. But this time, when I was offered the truth, I was able to sit and take it. Not alone though, by consulting men and mentors that were further down the path than me, females too, as it transpires, that said, this is where you should be now. You should be at this point of recognition. You should be learning this. You know, like, I don't know if you've taken powerful hallucinogens or drugs at all, but there's sometimes a moment where you want to grip on to the sort of rim of who you were and go, no, I'm not going to go on this journey. I'm staying me. I'm staying me. But hopefully there'll be someone there to say, hey, you have to let go. You have to go with this experience. This is how it is with the mental breakdown. You have to be available to what it is that's happening. I'm not talking about people that are in sanitariums going literally balmy. Those people need, you know, I'm assuming, medicating and round-the-clock support. I'm talking about a more secular, quotidian, everyday breakdown, which potentially is an opportunity to become the person that you were intended to be.
So, he's a little unorthodox using hallucinogens as an example of going through this process of enlightenment, but really it's, he has a point there in which we go, so when we have an experience in which, things start to come to light and we've started to analyze our surroundings as like this is what it is, like we start to live in our present day, and we don't live in the past, or we don't live towards making this ideal future, but we're living in the present. And we come to this idea in which we know, right? Like we know the idea of what we want to do. And once you have that revelation, not like, and you talked about this adolescent view, like, oh, this is what I want to be when I grow up. No, when you're grown up and you're kind of figuring things out in the present day, what are those steps forward? And he talks a little bit about this spiritual awakening. He kind of using more of a Buddhistic approach, this rebirth of yourself. But he's got a point in which you have to break this cycle in which, if something you're doing consistently is not working, what can we do different, right? The miracle question in counseling, what we use, we call it the miracle question for the most part, but there's a lot of different names for it. And it's pretty much, it goes like this. If you could wake up tomorrow and all the things that you wish were there that aren't there is there. So if everything is going smooth sound and everything is perfect, what would change in your life for that to happen? Right? That's the miracle question. That's what we all go, that's what all counselors kind of ride on. What questions can we tap on that can build up to this miracle question? Right? For Russell Brand, it was this spiritual enlightening in which he actually didn't go on it alone. He found people that he said were further in the journey than he was. So those who kind of understand themselves and just kind of have their own expertise in what they want. Not necessarily saying that that's what he wants, but saying that this is the journey I went on, take it with a grain of salt, And this is what Russell is saying. Like, if you ask people, you go out and you find help, that help will find you too, right? You open yourself up to others. You open yourself up to not just counselors, but your friends and family. Or even just a friend that you just care about. A friend, somebody you not even care about, you feel secure. You feel like they're going to give you back what you're giving out. They're going to meet you at that level, right? If you can find that person, to just open up with, they can help you in this breakthrough experience, this Eureka effect. It's a little bit of a step, but it helps your thought processing move along. And then, again, we'll talk about incubation stage. But yes, let's finish it up.
For me, when I started to think, well, there was a moment where I thought, I don't want to do this job anymore. I don't want to be around these people anymore. I don't want to live this life anymore. And Eckhart Tolle says, doesn't he, I can't live with myself any longer, was his personal moment of epiphany, where he recognised that I cannot live with myself. How many people are there in there? And Eckhart Tolle brilliantly unravels how the ever-present witness begins to be repulsed by the ego, that there's a point of awakening, that in a way we live many lives now that, like I'm assuming those of us watching videos on our phones where we're not getting attacked by saber-toothed tigers or bubonic plague, we live these long lives and have the opportunity to die many times. And a mental breakdown is a kind of death, it's a kind of end. But from that, there can be a rebirth. The caterpillar deconstitutes entirely in that chrysalis. It don't just acquire wings and antennae, it becomes as liquid, dies unto itself, liquefies, annihilated, gone, that it can be reborn.
All right, I think that's kind of a good message. So whenever you go through a breakdown, whenever something is so just absolutely overwhelming to the point where your body is falling down, it's not falling apart, but your body is just over consumed by emotion, and that emotion in your body is making you feel crippled. It's like, as what Russell Brand said, it's kind of like you're dying. This old part of you is dying, and the new part of you is molding and becoming something else. And it's more of a positivist way. Again, that's more of a Buddhistic way of thinking, right? More of in a spirituality understanding, is that we are changing as life events kind of happen. And, even with that, the micro aspects of change in which goes on within yourself, when you start to genuinely go through the process of understanding, how you're feeling, the emotions that's going on, and how is that based on what's going on around you. When you go through that process and you're breaking down, there's a point where you start to get up. Have you ever noticed that? Like, every time you fall to the ground, you might be crying, you might be upset, you might be just going through not even just an episode, but just a moment. Like, I don't like the word episode, because I think it desensitizes, the issues you're going through, the dilemmas you're going through, as valid as they are. So when you're going through this moment, this experience in which you are christening and you're just getting piled on by shit, and it just comes to a standstill, and your body is just going through the process of elevation to exhaustion, like the general adaptation system, you come to a point where you get back up. You've had your rest, and your body's recuperated. Your mind might not be well, but you've come to a point where you've taken your deep breaths. Your body has come to a point where it's found an equilibrium, of homeostasis. When you come to that point, it's like you're reborn a new person. And to me, I don't think it's a whole new person, obviously, because you're still stuck with these thoughts and ideas. But you get up, you do the microscopic thing, and you get up and you keep moving. Whatever the next whatever the next solution that you have, whether it's to open up to somebody or to try to take matters in your own hands, you still get up, right? And we need to consider that, because the moment we give up is the moment that we feel defeated and we just can't move. There's a lot, remember the crippling aspects of just feeling just absolutely destroyed, right? Whether it's catatonic, you're just a vegetable, or if it's like you're slowing down in your daily priorities and your responsibilities, you're slowing down, lack of motivation, all that stuff. You know, that's due to that moment in which you've broken down and went through this process. So breakdown doesn't always necessarily mean you're moving forward. It can mean you're moving backwards. But in my perspective, if you break down and you have a overconsumption of these ideas and thoughts that are just piling up, you become aware. So for that part of a breakdown, you are moving forward. But our actions are not always represent what we're thinking. So we sometimes move backwards. So it's this tug of war. That's what's going on, is this tug of war between self-identity, our environment, internal struggles, and maybe struggles that we've been dealing with since childhood, right? There's things that linger for such a long time and we just never deal with them, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere some shit happens. Why? Because we just never dealt with what was going on. We might have had a moment or multiple moments, but we never found any resolution from those moments. It was just something that happened, right? Coincidental. So, you know, as what Russell Brand colorfully explained, is that we have this point in which when we have a breakdown, we absorb, or we accustom certain things that we didn't have before, right? So I want you guys to think about that, right? When you have a breakdown and it feels like everything's collapsing around you and you feel like you have no answers, what is different this time compared to the last time? What has changed? Why do you feel a little bit of relief aside from all this stress and anxiety and depression? What is making it feel different this time than it did last time? Any counselor will tell you that, right? Because that change, that frequency in change, is what's going to help your own treatment process, right? That's how doctors and well, just doctors and just anybody in a business model understands change over time, is how can we mathematically understand it? So let's talk about a breakthrough. What's it called again? The Eureka effect, or the aha effect. So the Eureka effect, just a little bit of history. It's Greek for I have found it. Right? I have found it. And it was based on this polymath dude named Archimedes, who he was the king asked, I don't know if this is actually genuinely true, but he was supposed to try to find how much of a crown is made of gold, and while he was in the bathtub, he kind of sunk into the water, and he found this understanding between water, what was it, water displacement. Just figuring that, like, I guess, that the ground wasn't 100% made of gold. And in that moment, he popped out of that tub and he ran naked, screaming Eureka. And that's how we have it. That is the tale. And literally every article that talks about Eureka talks about that. So I'm just gonna consider it true. But it's pretty much this moment in which you found it. You've had this moment in which you come to enlightenment because you've had a moment, and it could be through the incubation stage, or it could be through, just actively working, that you've found your answers, right? So here is a study I found, a very interesting study, and again, 2021. Wanted to keep it as new as possible. Pretty much talking about the brain activity in our minds when we go through a Eureka moment. And when you go through a Eureka moment, you're going... Here, let me actually turn on the music because I'll lose my train of thought. I'm sorry. So when you're going through this Eureka moment, you pretty much have solved the problem, right? And you have this feeling, this sense of relief that this problem I can actually close the case on. But there's also neural activity that goes on in your brain. In this study, how many people did they do it on? They did it on introduction, methods. 1 in 30,000 images were included in the initial database. It's just a selection of images. Participants, 10 subjects with included. Okay, so another 29 healthy subjects. Okay, it's not a lot of people. Not a lot of people did this, but it's still interesting to look at. Pretty much what they found is that after giving small tasks to people trying to, they're trying to come up with like math solutions and trying to figure out how to figure out these, whatever the problem is at hand. And they come to this point in which there is a high frequency of... It goes from beta waves, as we talked about before. Beta waves is when we're highly conscious and it has the most frequency within brain activity and action potentials. Talk about the firing of neurons in your brain. It has so beta waves is your most active state, but it dramatically changes from beta waves when you have that Eureka moment to alpha and theta waves. It's almost like when you have that sense of relief, you just sit back. You literally just, like, it's like your body just relaxes and just like kind of accepts what's going on, and it's like, yes, this is it. This is the moment. When you're in an incubation stage, how often have you guys been in a situation where you're not thinking about something, but things just naturally work itself out because you're just not thinking about it, and all of a sudden, whether you're reading a book, playing a game, and you just answered your own problem. How often does that happen? Right? For people, it works differently, but I know it's happened to me a couple of times. Quite a few times, actually. That's just my ADHD, right? Like, when I'm not thinking about something, that's when I'm at my most active state about thinking about something. I'm just everywhere, bro. But, there you go. Brainwaves have to do with how active our brain states are. So when we're going through a breakdown, we're at a high frequency of beta waves. Things are firing off. The amount of action potentials or neuron firings in your brain is just it's just super consistent, and that can be tiring, right? Your brain consistently at work can get to the point where it gets to an exhaustion stage. And then it will start to go into alpha and theta waves. But imagine having that moment and then immediately changing from beta waves in your brain to alpha or theta. Theta, you're just like fucking gone. You're like, yes, this is it. I figured it out. It took me 2 months, 2 years, 1,000. It took a lifetime, but I figured it out. And you just go from B to T, just like that, man. So whenever you have those moments, when you go through breakthrough, just remember that your body will feel it. You will have, it's not just, oh, I feel spiritually enlightened, or I feel like enlightened in my life. It's not like, oh, this conceptual thought. No, you feel it. You physically feel that phenomenon, right? So when you have that moment, you'll feel it. You know how we always say stick to your instincts? Well, damn it, stick to your instincts, man. You know you have an answer, ride with it. Go over it, like talk about it with others, please do. But hold on to that, because that is the moment in which something has changed. That is your sense of progress because of change. And you know what that change is. It makes sense. So, what are some ways in which we experience Eureka? How do we all experience it? This is kind of like an article. And again, I find most of these articles on Psychology Today because, you know, this is probably your best, one of the best resources to diving inside the mind of a doctor within psychology or psychiatry. Psychology Today. So he's talking about the history of daydreamers and all that stuff, and then he comes across the process known as the incubation. So incubation stage, in which the thinker has temporarily set aside his or her attempt to solve a problem and has turned to other thoughts. So starting to think outside the box. But behind the current of consciousness, the brain's many computers are always at work. Right? So you start to either change your thought process, or you just start to move on to another task and work and let kind of like the problem-solving mechanisms of your brain take over, which is your preconscious brain, right? In psychoanalytics, you have the conscious mind, you have the preconscious mind, and then you have the unconscious mind. Unconscious mind are the things that are underneath the surface that you don't really notice most of the time. It's just kind of like your internal workings of your brain. And then you have the preconscious mind, which is when you have thoughts, ideas, and stuff. Like, you learn things in school, you don't always use them, but it's still in your brain. So in your preconscious mind, that's where it's stowed, right? It's kind of like a little bit of below the surface, but it's not down there in the unconscious mind where, you know, some internal processes are just working naturally rather than with more of a systematic approach. It's just, yeah, it's more of your body and mind just doing its own thing. Unconscious mind, that's where all your memories and your working memory the information and everything is being stowed there and being worked itself out, and will be eventually moved to, you know, long-term potentiation within your hippocampus, or with, it will be a significant memory. You just don't really, it's still in your brain. You're still kind of digesting the information and whatever you're doing. So the incubation stage is that preconscious process in which we are doing another task, and we have this moment in which an idea or thought pops in our brain about the original task, and it helps us find this Eureka moment. There's a Eureka experience from time to time, that flash of the insight suddenly explains something. Okay. The most notorious is Isaac Newton in the apple, which might... And he has other examples, but we're just going to read a couple. So the most notorious example of Isaac Newton in the apple, which might or might not have actually occurred, Yeah, again, when we're talking about history, going back to Newton and Galileo and all that shit, sometimes history is not all written out there, right? But these are just the stories that kind of elicit that understanding of, okay, if I was in Newton's or Galileo's shoes, this is what he was kind of going through at the time, right? According to legend, Newton had left London and the university to stay at his parents' farm in the in the countryside while sitting under a tree. On a pleasant day, he suddenly conceived the phenomenon of gravity because of the apple falling from the tree, right? So he wasn't thinking about science until science came to him. And then that brought up this idea like, oh fuck, we might be onto this whole understanding of gravity. Galileo, who left the planet the same year that Newton arrived, so he died the same year that Newton was born, had a similar daydream insight. He was sitting quietly at a church. He absently watched a candelabra suspended from the ceiling, and it swung slowly back and forth in the slight breeze. The length of the swing increased and increased with the breeze, but it had suddenly relation to the period of pendulum he was watching. The length of the time needed to complete the full swing from the end to the end seemed to stay the same. On the longer swings, the candle moved faster, and the total swing time was constant. This led him to the experiments that verified the period of a pendulum depended on only one variable, the length of the chain or string holding up, and the weight of the suspended object had no difference. Just chilling, looking at a pendulum, and came up with this idea of back and forth motion and why things are the way they are in regards to physics. So again, many stories out here talking about this Eureka effect, but really, this Eureka effect is just the moment in which, whether knowledge or wisdom influenced or whatever it is, whatever that moment in which you've realized something has changed, will lead to this breakthrough. But it has to be, it's in stages, right? So when we get to this. So if we rewind, we go to the breakdown effect. Things are piling on. You go through a breakdown in which you can't move. You feel nauseous. You feel you might get hungry. You just feel like you're bedridden. Don't want to do anything. You're feeling just absolutely crippled. This moment, when you come to a point in which you get exhausted from all this overconsumption of information and brain power, you come to this point in which you decompress and slow down. Your body naturalistically needs to slow down for a second before you go back into just horror mode. When you go to that point, what is different now? You talk every time you go through a breakdown, you think about how the past has led to now. Most of the times you think about that. And at that point, when you're thinking about the past and past experiences, get out of here. Think about those past experiences. What has changed? And you can't come up with one reason which something has been different, then you are living in a constant cycle, my friend, in which you're consistently going through the same bottled thoughts, and you're kind of sitting on these experiences that never got digested, and it starts to throw back up, right? It starts to come back out. So how do you eat healthy? How do you change? It happens individualistically, and it happens in small increments, but it happens. And that's what we have to understand. You know, from a professional to you guys, I'm trying to tell you guys that even though something feels so crippling and so devastating, there is a change that goes on. Kind of what Russell Brand was saying. You're kind of dying inside. But then you come to a point where you're reborn. You get back up. And at that point, how are you going to use that experience to help you move forward? How are you guys going to take whatever breakdown you have and take it to your next counselor's appointment or to your friend's house to talk about it, or your family? How are you going to take this information and open it up? Well, how does this make sense to you? And if it doesn't make sense, that's okay. That's what we're here for. But there's always a microscopic part of that moment that lingers. It lingers. And when sometimes we black out from these experiences, which is a bodily response. When we have a situation, our sympathetic nervous system goes through this fight, flight, or freeze physiological response. When you freeze up and you start to black out, what do you remember? What microscopic aspect of that breakdown do you remember? And that's usually going to lead to your breakthrough. It might be microscopic, but it's going to lead to something greater. And that's what we have to consider, ladies and gentlemen, is that not everything regarding psychology can be fixed in a minute. It can't be fixed with pills all the time. You have to digest what's going on for your body to understand the nutrients of what's going on, the over amount of calories that you've consumed. And I might be using food as an example, but there's so many examples you can use to say, how do we just feel crippled and find a way through? How do we prevail through the struggles in our life? Well, it's not going to be a one-way path. I'm going to tell you that. There are going to be many paths. There are going to be right paths that you find. There are going to be the wrong paths. And we have to, as people, as social beings, break it down. When we think about a problem, what term do we use? What conceptual thinking do we use to break something down? And that's more of a positivistic way of putting it. When I think of a breakdown, I think of more of a positive type of train of thought when you're thinking about a problem. When you're thinking about a breakthrough, you're thinking about just like a revelation. That's probably the best way I can put it in a positivist thought process, is that when you break something down, you're breaking down each problem one at a time. And when you're going through a breakthrough, you've come to a revelation in which your life has changed for the better. So that's what I want to leave you with today. Again, this was our quick little talk about breakdowns versus breakthroughs. If anybody has any questions, you guys are more than happy to ask. I mean, I always have an answer for y'all. But for the most part, we are just trying to understand these concepts because we don't really talk about them that much. I know counselors don't. We talk about, treatment, but how does that achieve this understanding of a breakthrough? Well, that's measured in different ways. But your measurement, as what I was talking about, remember Sabin, in our interview, we talked about we have our different types of metrics. All of us have different types of metrics. We measure things, and we are measured by people in different ways. But we're all different in those metrics, and finding the right formula to an equation that have seemed to be daunting can feel life-changing. But it all starts with one bit at a time. One X, one O, one number, one person. It all starts in one microscopic way. It works one step at a time, and then eventually you will meet that 100%. 1% better every day, right, guys? So that we can meet our 100%, or even above 100% in the days to come, right? So thank you again, guys. Thank you for talking with me about this. This is a very important subject, I think. But yeah, guys, again, always consider these type of concepts going through day-to-day life, because if you're aware of this, if you're conscious, if you're open to learning how change occurs in your life, you're more than likely to find these Eureka moments a lot more often than you think. But how do you measure change? That is more of a bigger question.